Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. Today, we're going to kind of explore this idea of ego, and not the kind that inflates our heads like, oh, look at me, but the kind that drives us, for better or for worse.
Yeah,
So we're going to be dissecting this book excerpt that really zeroes in on how ego can influence both our successes and our failures. And to illustrate this, we're going to be looking at some real-world figures that you've probably heard of, folks like Steve Jobs and Dov Charney.
Oh, yeah.
Really fascinating stories that kind of show the power of ego in action.
Yeah, it's really interesting how this excerpt starts off by talking about ego as this constant internal struggle. It's like a civil war within ourselves.
Yeah.
I think what Martin Luther King Jr. said that so vividly, and it's so true.
That is a powerful image. I love that civil war. It really kind of sets the stage for this inner battle that we all face. The excerpt also points out how difficult self-examination can be, especially when it comes to our ego. It's almost as if we shy away from confronting that part of ourselves. What do you think?
Absolutely. I think it's so much easier to kind of sweep those uncomfortable feelings under the rug.
Right.
The author actually suggests that some of humanity's greatest achievements might have been fueled by this very desire to avoid facing those inner demons.
Wow. So it's like this double-edged sword,
Yeah.
acknowledging our ego is important, but then how do we actually manage it? Is it a one-time fix? Or are we looking at like a lifetime of ego maintenance?
I think it's more like daily upkeep.
Okay.
The excerpt uses this really cool analogy of sweeping the floor. Just because you swept yesterday doesn't mean you won't have dust again today.
That's true.
And ego is similar. It requires constant attention and vigilance.
Okay, so we need to be constantly vigilant, doing the little ego dusting every day.
Yeah,
I'm starting to see why this is a deep dive and not a quick dip.
exactly.
So speaking of these ego dust bunnies, the excerpt goes on to discuss the consequences of letting that ego run wild, especially through the story of Dov Charney and the rise and fall of American Apparel.
Yeah, and what's so fascinating about Charney's story is his reaction to being ousted from the company that he built.
Right.
He reportedly called the author late at night, feeling like his failure was akin to death.
Oh, wow.
It really highlights how deeply intertwined our ego can become with our sense of self-worth.
Yeah, it sounds like his ego was so attached to the success of the company that he couldn't separate his own identity from it. It's like that late night call almost paints a picture of ego in a state of panic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this brings up a crucial question for all of us. How can understanding this ego factor help us navigate our own inevitable setbacks?
Right.
Because let's face it, everyone encounters bumps in the road. It's how we deal with those challenges
Yeah.
that really reveals the state of our ego.
So before we dive deeper into those potential pitfalls,
Yeah.
let's talk a bit more about how we can actually recognize these ego dust bunnies.
Okay.
The excerpt talks about ego's tendency to create these grand monument delusions. What exactly does that mean?
It's this idea that we often feel pressured to create something monumental with our lives, something that will last forever. This desire for lasting impact can be driven by ego. And when things don't go according to plan, that same ego can whisper, see, you're a failure because you haven't built your pyramid.
Yeah, it's like we're all expected to leave behind these massive indelible marks on the world, and anything less just gets swept away by the sands of time.
Right.
No wonder so many of us struggle with feelings of inadequacy.
Yeah.
And the excerpt even mentions that the author themselves struggled with this grand monument delusion while writing the very book we're discussing.
It's a great point. It shows that even those who study ego can get caught in its traps. It's a human experience, not something reserved for certain personality types.
So what happens when we let this grand monument mindset fueled by ego take over? Are we talking like dramatic downfalls and karmic retribution?
Not necessarily.
Yeah.
The excerpt argues that the consequences of unchecked ego aren't always so overt or dramatic. They're often subtler or insidious. It's less about a sudden crash and burn and more about a slow decline into a kind of spiritual emptiness.
That's interesting. Can you give us an example of what that might look like?
Sure, the excerpt uses the novel What Makes Sammy Run as a case study.
Okay.
It tells the story of this ambitious Hollywood mogul who's driven solely by ego, clawing his way to the top, leaving a trail of broken relationships in his wake. And in the end, despite achieving outward success, he's completely miserable, consumed by loneliness, fear, and insecurity, all the things a healthy ego is supposed to protect us from.
So it's like he wins the game but loses himself in the process.
Exactly, a hollow victory indeed.
Wow.
And what makes this example even more compelling is the author's personal connection to the novel.
Right.
They read it at 19, found success later in life, and then experienced a similar situation, feeling those same pangs of emptiness despite achieving external goals.
Wow, talk about life imitating art. It reminds me of that quote. I think it was Bismarck who said, "Only a fool learns from his own mistakes. The wise man learns from the mistakes of others."
Precisely.
Hmm.
And this entire deep dive is really about learning from those who have walked this path before us. The point isn't to demonize ambition or strive for some unattainable egoless state.
Right.
It's about finding that delicate balance.
Yeah, the excerpt makes a distinction between ambition and ego. It's not an either situation. We don't have to choose between pursuing our goals and being good people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In fact, the excerpt argues that cultivating qualities like humility, selflessness, and balance not only make us better humans, but also contribute to our overall success. These qualities help us navigate the inevitable challenges that come with pursuing any kind of ambitious goal.
Okay.
Think of them as shock absorbers for the ego,
Hmm.
helping us bounce back from setbacks and maintain perspective.
That's a good analogy. And this all kind of ties back to that initial idea of ego as a constant internal struggle, you know?
Yeah.
The excerpt outlines three specific phases where ego really comes into play: aspiration, success, and failure. It seems like no matter where we are on that journey, our ego is always there waiting to trip us up. So it seems like no matter where we are in life, whether we're just starting out or we're riding high on success or facing some setbacks, our ego is kind of this constant companion,
Yeah.
always whispering in our ear. It
Mhm.
really brings us back to that analogy of sweeping the floor,
Right.
this never-ending task. We can't just ignore our ego and expect it to magically disappear.
It's about awareness and intention.
Yeah.
The more we understand how our ego operates,
Hmm.
the better equipped we are to manage it. And that doesn't mean suppressing or denying our ego. It's about recognizing its influence and making
Hmm.
conscious choices about how we respond to its whispers.
So it's not about eradicating ego altogether, but rather developing like a healthy relationship with it.
Exactly. It's about harnessing the power of ego without letting it control us.
Mm.
The excerpt doesn't offer like a simple solution or a step-by-step guide. It leaves us with a powerful question for self-reflection.
Okay, I'm all ears. What's the question?
It asks, what will you do with this knowledge about ego? Not just today, not just tomorrow, but for the rest of your life. It's a challenge to take this understanding and apply it to our own lives, to become more conscious of our ego's influence and make choices that align with our values and aspirations.
It's like the excerpt is handing us a map and saying, go explore. The journey of self-discovery and ego management is yours to navigate.
And that's what makes this exploration so valuable. It's not just about accumulating knowledge, but about integrating it into our lives,
Yeah.
using it to make more informed decisions, and ultimately to create a life that is both fulfilling and meaningful.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into this world of ego,
Yeah.
what's like the one key takeaway we want our listeners to ponder?
I think the big takeaway is that managing our ego isn't about denying our ambition or striving for an unattainable state of perfection.
Right.
It's about recognizing that ego is a part of us, but it doesn't have to be the one calling the shots. We can choose to harness its energy in positive ways, fueling our passions while staying grounded and connected to the things that truly matter.
That's beautifully put. So to our listeners, as you go about your day, consider how your ego might be influencing your thoughts, decisions, and interactions. And remember, you have the power to choose how you respond. Until next time, keep diving deep.